So, hello everyone in EDU 383 Collaborative Transition Planning for students who are differently abled, and particularly students with low incidence disabilities. This is really a wonderful and a critical week for us in terms of the reading. We're finishing up the Job Developers Handbook. At the same time, the two chapters that we're looking at, chapters 10 and chapter 11, really hold a lot of very valuable information, valuable insight, and I think some suggestion of how attitudes and values and performance can change when it comes to people who are differently abled. So this is one of those weeks when reading those chapters front to back would be very important, because the ideas that are included in these chapters are really very, very critical. And they almost form the basis for everything that you're going to be doing, not only as job developers potentially in your community, but also as special educators in your schools. So chapter 10 deals with active families, and this is really, really an important chapter to consider. It starts off by talking about the importance of relationships, and you will have to cultivate relationships with families of students who are differently abled in your careers and in your professional function. That's not always easy. My experience with families, particularly families of students who have low incidence disabilities, is that it is extremely tough to be able to develop trusting relationships with them for a number of different reasons. One is that the families are having an experience. They're experiencing life with their child. They're experiencing life with a child with a disability. And that means, and particularly in the case of low incidence disabilities, that means having to go to treatments, having to go to medical appointments in some cases, working with a whole battery of different professionals, all of whom are different, all of whom have different ideas, thoughts, attitudes, assumptions about the child. So coordinating all that and making all that work is a pretty daunting task, and it needs to be done. And you, as the caseworker in the school, will be the person who will be primarily responsible as the special educator for making sure that those teams function successfully and that you build relationships with your families. I say extremely tough. So living with disability and living with a disability and a person with a disability is time consuming. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of focus. It takes a lot of education that parents are doing for their youngsters. So it requires a lot of patience. And as you know, you've been in situations where students who are differently abled with low incidence disabilities go to camp or go to respite. You provide respite for parents. Those kinds of things are necessary given the fact that there's such an intensity about this enterprise, about doing this in families. So really being aware of that first and foremost, and sympathizing and empathizing with families who have to advocate almost constantly for their child, as well as make sure that their child is protected and safe and educated, and that their high expectations, etc. There's a level of energy, there's a level of frustration, there's a level generally in families of these students who there's a level of anxiety also that makes building relationships, trusting relationships with schools and with community organizations very tentative and very tenuous. So there's this focus on disability on the one hand. The second thing that really makes it very, very difficult for parents, and here's where you as special educators in schools really come in, is that the CSE meetings and the entire special education process is wearing. There's that sense, again, of constantly having to advocate for your child, also having to work with different therapists, and different support providers in different ways makes it for the parents very difficult. And again, that level of trust as they're shifted from one professional to another as they move up through the school system can really make parents and caregivers very wary of systems and very wary of directors of special education, principals who can't or won't or don't provide the kind of supports and the kinds of relationships that parents really need and think should be in place to support their child. The other thing that's working against these parents, the chapter tells us, is the culture. American culture, with its focus on exceptionality, interesting word, really is a culture about success. And we put on pedestals people who are successful in different ways, but we don't really look at them as models. We look at the success as somehow different from the hard work that it took to get there, or different than the luck that it took to get to that particular position. So we really don't look at anyone who's been successful in the culture as having a whole story and being a whole person in the process of arriving at that success. So in many ways, when we measure the success of people who are differently abled against that kind of cultural standard, it looks much different. And potentially it looks as though all of our advocacy and our work may not have developed the kinds of opportunities that we would have hoped for these students. So the culture generally doesn't understand disability, doesn't welcome disability. There isn't a lot of modeling of disability in the culture. People who are working and families who are working with and being with people who are differently abled don't have any models, and their children don't have any models for what this should be. So reclaiming or claiming what those models could be in your own mind with your own assumptions and your own attitudes is very, very important. The last thing that stands in the way, in addition to disability, in addition to school systems, in addition to cultural systems, is the need for support. And that's not always freely given. That's not always found. So one of the things that you also need to do as special educators in schools is make sure that there is this support system that surrounds the family, and as much as possible in the school and outside the school. So there's a sense of the developing community around this particular individual that can afford some success in the long run. So it's important, because provider relations are also inconsistent in many ways, to create some consistency, some level of stability, and first and foremost, some level of trust with the families. Stay in touch, let them know what's going on, give them a clear understanding of how their students are doing in school, communicate with them often and in detailed and specific ways, so that parents know and parents and caregivers learn to trust you. So working with families requires a perspective and developing a perspective, which all of you have really developed, I think, pretty well at your time at Keuka College. One is questioning assumptions. Assumptions are never good, particularly when they're about individuals, because they limit expectations in many cases. So don't assume anything and be open to the possibilities that any student can afford you. Those possibilities and those opportunities are things you should be looking at. Can the attitude, going in, listening. We talked about listening a little bit last week. Being objective, not being defensive, and having an attitude of a positive attitude that anything can happen and anything good can be done in any situation, in any human situation. Good can happen. Keeping that and being mindful of that is important. Listening carefully and listening carefully to your caregivers is also a must. Building those relationships through communication, through education, through invitations to the school, through your continued advocacy along with the family's advocacy for your students is very important. Do your job well, be competent, try things out. Think about the different methodologies that we talked about in 343 and utilize them. They're evidence-based practices and they will help your students succeed. Build a presence, not only at the school, but also in the community. You don't want to rock the boat too fast, as I said last week, when it comes to seeking tenure, for example. But definitely as you become more respected for your work and your competency, develop a presence and speak out in advocacy for these individuals and in advocacy for your program. So the roles that you're going to undertake as special educators, first of all, engaging with careers and including caregivers in building careers and thinking about careers from a very early age, as soon as possible. As soon as you start handling that caseload and that student, maybe at a secondary level in a small school, emphasize the need to be thinking about what potential careers could be available for those students, because families don't always think about that. They really think that they're going to remain with their students until those students or until they pass away. So the idea of independent living, the idea of career exploration are probably the furthest things from their minds, just given how the culture works, the school works, and the kinds of loads that they carry as caregivers. So opening the door to engaging with careers opens the door to engaging with more possibilities and opportunities on the part of families. Encourage your families to build responsibility in their children. That's not always easy, but checking in from time to time and finding out what students are doing at home, what kinds of responsibilities they have, what kinds of tasks they're building on, what's the transferability of the task structure from the school to the family and then back to the school, so that you're teaching and reinforcing what's going on at home. Those are all important steps to build that sense of responsibility in the caregivers, and having them understand their responsibilities as yours is, building into an independent living environment and a career that is fruitful for their students and for their children at home. Encourage them to explore interests, encourage them to explore life experiences, and provide those for their students, but also talk about them. Again, it's not a question of, oh, you should be doing this. It's a question of, what are you doing about life experiences? What kind of experiences is your child having at home or having outside the home that we might be able to build on? Ask questions and listen to the answers. It's never a sense of, parents and caregivers should be doing this or should not be doing that. It's a question of, what are you doing and how can we build supports in? Find peer mentors at the school. Find peer mentors in the community, neighbors and other people who can be trusted, other students who can be trusted to work with this individual, can also provide a valuable springboard to thinking about different career opportunities and life options. And finally, network and develop team support. So one of the things I've noticed is that often outside of pre-referral meetings and occasional meetings with therapists who come in and out, different BOCES and itinerant therapists that might work in New York State, developing a sense of the team, taking the time to talk about values, talk about inclusion, talk about attitudes with those team members are important steps in creating a more unified and a transparent method of working with caregivers and families when they come in to work with you in the school and in CSE meetings. So develop a network outside the school, and develop that team support. So those are some of the highlights from chapter 10, which, as I said, I think is a very important chapter and gets into some of the details and important details that chapter 2 reflected in our working and teaching students who are differently abled with low incidence disabilities first semester. So those two particular chapters are nice bookends to this particular course. So let's move on to chapter 11. Chapter 11 may seem on the surface to be a sort of a polemic, sort of a chapter that encourages you to look at leadership, and you might think to yourself, well, what does leadership have to do with me? Well, teachers are leaders. They lead their children, they lead other teachers, they lead systems in many ways. So the kind of leadership that's talked about in chapter 11 and the ways of going about developing that leadership, which this chapter focuses on, is also very important for you to develop as special educators. So pay attention to chapter 11. You are a leader. And this particular chapter really applies nicely to schools and the work that you're going to be doing in schools. So number one, as a leader, what's the value? From my perspective, and what I'd encourage all leaders in special education to have as a first value, is inclusion. Everybody sits at the table. No decisions without us, no conversations and nothing about us without us. So bringing students into the mix and creating that kind of transparency at CSE meetings, speaking to students directly at CSE meetings, letting them and having them, giving them the floor to be able to talk about their successes, to be able to talk about their needs, to be able to talk about what they envision for themselves, are all very, very important steps in the transition process that you need to be mindful of. What are the barriers to you as a leader? The biggest barrier on the part of both families, and especially in terms of people who are differently abled, is learned helplessness. We do so much. We do for, instead of doing with and encouraging students to do on their own. So making independence and agency primary values in your working with students and you're working with teams and within school structures is also an important value to have. So inclusion, independence, agency. And as we've seen, school, employment, work are also, and social culture are also, you hang on a second, are also important, are barriers, and we also have to look to overcome them with our own attitudes and our own values. So the basic idea behind chapter 11 is support for people, change systems, because systems, as we know, are not inclusive and they don't welcome people who are differently abled. So we need to support our clients and support our students on the one hand, and we need to focus on changing systems on the other. How do we do that? Largely through education. We have to talk about the values of inclusion. We have to look at methodologies and research that encourage inclusion. And we have to advocate for it in our schools and try it to see that it works, and develop those kinds of models in our school systems. This chapter talks about the abundance mindset and the scarcity mindset. And those are really people that you can witness in meetings. You probably know these kinds of people among your colleagues. Some students and some people recognize that it's an abundant universe, that you can do and work toward anything and create opportunities that are limitless, because really fundamentally they are limitless. They're as limitless as our imaginations, and our imaginations are limitless. We can almost think of anything for our students to be able to function independently and have good careers. So that's an important mindset to have, as opposed to that scarcity mindset, which says we've always done it this way, we're not going to do it any differently, we can't, these people are students. Dean, please. I apologize. Dean's having a day. So yeah, scarcity. So that's really something to avoid. So how do you lead? What's the toolbox for leading? Number one, walk the talk. Inclusion starts with the team. Inclusion starts with the school and the teachers. Everyone is included in the process. Everyone is communicated with. When I was a principal at the Ryder Elementary School, I used to have a sign over my desk which said, "Who else needs to know?" So that whenever I made a decision, or whenever a decision was made in any capacity with a team or with a teacher about a student, I always asked myself, who else needed to know about this so that it could be communicated? So having that idea in mind, walking the talk of including everybody and communicating with everybody is a critical self-examination and a critical kind of a position that you need to have as a special educator in schools. So inclusion starts with the providers. Build relationships with the people in your community, at the school, know your teachers, care for them, know your administrators, and likewise care for them as well, and build relationships with caregivers and the community. Practice transparency. Let everybody look into your process of decision making. At CSE meetings, why did you develop these goals? Why did you develop these supports? Why did you develop these related services? It isn't a question of just laying them out on the table without any comment or without any consideration for how those decisions were made. It's important to talk about the process, talk about what you looked at. That gets into using data, and using data that's not just traditional like numbers, but using qualitative data, anecdotal data, observational data, and provide those to caregivers and others on the CSE team and the supports that surround this particular student. And finally, engage in change. So for your career and for your work, stay fresh. Recognize that things are not going to remain the same. They're not going to remain the same for your students. Things are going to change. And recognizing that things do change makes it easier to approach employers to develop jobs, makes it easier to think about transition from the big picture and develop ways and opportunities for your students to flourish once they transition out of or age out of the school system. So finally, the chapter talks about some other important baselines and groundwork for leadership. Number one, set a purpose. Set a purpose for the team, set a purpose for every individual that you work with, set a purpose that has to do with transition, and make sure that the purposes that you are creating align with the purposes of your organization and with your beliefs and values as special educators. Be flexible. Recognize that the map that you're developing, the transition plan, and the IEP that you're creating will change. So make sure that you view those documents and those maps as suggestions. And finally, education. Educate yourselves as a team, cross team. What does the occupational therapist really do? What does the adaptive physical education teacher really do? Go in, visit the classes, have them talk to you, get a clear sense of what they do, have them talk to other professionals. So it's not just you that knows, but that everybody on the team has a clear understanding of how they're contributing to the support of this particular student in your school system. And last of all, don't be afraid. Just don't be afraid. You know, there are two things that drive human beings. Where did I get this notion from 30 years of therapy? Two things drive human behavior. One is fear, and the other is love. So love, we hope, we want, will win out in the end. Love for your students, love for the caregivers, love for the job you're doing, love for the fact that you could and can and should and may and must develop inclusive systems for your students so that everybody is at the table and all decisions are transparent. And we know how to live together and welcome people with disabilities into the culture. Don't be afraid, because fear is the debilitating side of this. We have a lot of fear right now, and there's been a lot of fear for a while in terms of how our culture has developed. And the antidote to that, and the only antidote to that, is love and care in the form of compassion, in the form of going above and beyond, in the form of valuing people for who they are and recognizing that everybody can have agency and everybody can and will make a contribution to the culture and to the society and to the work of being. If we allow them to, if we encourage them to, and if we educate them to. Okay. So that's going to have to be it for today. It's kind of a crazy morning, wasn't it? Everybody was barking. Did I tell you I had 5 dogs in the house? I think I did. That was Sully who was howling, man. That guy, he ate a pastry brush the other day. I can hardly wait till my daughter comes back and takes him home. Anyway, I love you. You're doing a great job. And thank you so much for being with me. And I look forward to next week. Have a good Thanksgiving in the meantime. We'll meet and talk in the meantime as well. But thank you for being part of this meeting today in this class right now. So we'll see you later. Bye-bye.